Hello and welcome to another episode of the Breachside Broadcast, home of the finest voxcasting either side of the breach. On today's episode, we pick up the story of Cornelius, Mikhail, Jedza and Bernadette as they attempt to acquire a rare artifact for the Explorers Society. I hope you enjoy the conclusion of Nothing Is Forever, right after this word from our sponsor.
This episode of the Breachside Broadcast is brought to you by Condor Rails, makers of the finest locomotives and rail carriages either side of the breach. Our trains are custom built for the most discerning clients. They come equipped with the most luxurious furnishings money can buy, and you'll find a dining car fully stocked with gourmet food and top-shelf liquor. When you want to travel in style, choose Condor Rails.
Cornelius woke to the scent of salt pork sizzling on the fire and fresh tea. Jedza and Bernadette were already awake and talking. The old woman's auroch was investigating the weirdwood tree. Mikhail offered a plate and cup, and Cornelius groggily accepted. "Thanks," he said. The first few bites drew Cornelius' attention. The pork was strongly seasoned. A small wedge of bread, slathered in what looked to be some sort of jam, was nestled in the corner, along with a mixture of potatoes and eggs. Baz took a moment to take a sip of tea. "This is good," he said. The lawman's pleased tone made Mikhail laugh. "I'm glad you think so. The road is not always generous, but I've learned to make do with what I have." Cornelius shook his head and raised his cup. Bernadette wandered over a moment later with an empty plate. Mikhail beckoned, and she held out her dish. In a few moments she had a new hill of potatoes, eggs, and pork. She plopped down next to her father and began eating. Cornelius furrowed his brow. "Is that your second plate?" he admonished quietly. Bernadette chewed more slowly, as if trying to figure out the best way to both keep her breakfast and avoid her father's scolding. "It is no trouble," Mikhail interjected before shouldering his blade. "Better to eat than let it go to waste." He stood and left the Basses to their breakfast, moving to help Jedza up onto Sophie's back. When everyone had finished breakfast, the auroch began to trundle forward, bells jingling softly. Mikhail followed, and the Basses brought up the rear. Bernadette glanced around, making sure their new companions were out of earshot before she spoke. "So?" "They're a bit odd," Cornelius said in a low voice. She snorted. "A bit? That's an understatement." Cornelius shrugged. "Do you think those stories she was telling were true?" Bernadette continued. "Maybe." "Sometimes you're not very helpful, Dad." Bernadette grinned before sloshing around her canteen. "And tea? I mean, it's okay, but it's no coffee." Bass ruffled Bernadette's hair, earning admonition from his daughter in the process. "Come on, let's catch up before they get too far ahead." The Basses picked up their pace. They reached Mikhail first. Bernadette, ever inquisitive, pressed the big man for more details. "Hey, so I gotta ask, you're alive, right?" He laughed softly. "Yes, I'm alive. But so are they, in a strange way." "Then what got you mixed up with them?" Mikhail didn't answer at first. He hesitated, as if trying to figure out how best to answer such a weighty question. Before the silence stayed for too long, Mikhail began to speak. The prospect of sharing his story with someone other than an immortal collector or a cow got the better of him. A promise was made. "I am not the first, Mikhail. There were many before me, he answered. Bernadette was more confused than when she started. What does that mean? Mikhail stopped and took the heavy blade from his back. Instead of bringing the sword to bear, Mikhail held it by the haft. He pointed to a list of markings that ran from the very edge of the hilt down to almost the center of the blade. Cornelius noted they were heavily weathered and written in a language he didn't recognize. My family always has a Mikhail that accompanies Jedza. When it is time, we etch our birth name into this sword and then become the new Mikhail. We are chosen for a lifetime. It is a heavy burden, the man joked, hefting the blade back up and starting to walk again. But I have my ancestors to keep me company. And Sophie, he laughed. It is an honor to travel in Jedza's shadow. Cornelius nodded. Honor, he understood. Bernadette still seemed confused. So you've been with her since you were born? Bernadette asked. Not quite. I became her new Mikhail when I was about 20. That makes you what, the 4th or 5th Mikhail? If the blade has kept a good count all these years, then I am the 16th. Silence shrouded the conversation for a moment. Bernadette counted off on her fingers, expression growing more stunned. How old is she? Mikhail just shrugged. She is Jedza. She was old when she saved my people, and that was many centuries ago. Oh. The realization weighed on the Basses. The three went quietly for a time, and soon caught up to Jedza and Sophie. Bernadette briefly glanced over at the skeletal woman riding atop the auroch, oversized bag behind her, and umbrella over one shoulder. Despite Bernadette's curiosity, she couldn't quite will herself to touch anything near the undead bovine. Instead, she focused on the landscape ahead. So far, it had been nothing but flat brushland, with only an occasional shrub or tree to break up the monotony. So where exactly are we going? Bernadette piped up. Jedza looked down. A railway. Close by, but I am told it has not been used in some time. Before Bernadette could ask, Cornelius stopped and interjected. Wait, I thought you said we were heading somewhere northwest. Trains don't even run out here anymore, as far as I'm aware. Jedza's voice was relaxed. Do not worry. You are not the only ones helping us on this journey. It is too difficult for me to travel through a city. Not everyone is as accepting as you. Yet, the society has arranged for something special. Cornelius cocked his head at Bernadette, and his daughter understood. Stay alert. Hours later, weathered railroad tracks came into view, occupied by a massive black locomotive with 3 luxury cars in tow. The logo of the Condor Rails prominently adorned the side of an engine, a winged train painted in grey. As they made their way toward the train, a small-statured man stepped from the locomotive and waved to them. Afternoon, Cornelius called, his eyes still scanning for trouble. The conductor tipped his cap before addressing the group. A fine afternoon to you all. We were wondering if you would make it before evening. It is my privilege to welcome you aboard. He opened the wide door to one of the train cars. Mikhail helped Jedza up the steps, and Sophie clumsily followed, awkward as she was. The carriage was wide enough to easily accommodate the auroch's bulk. Bernadette couldn't help but give a low whistle when she stepped inside. The interior was opulent, to say the least. 4 booths upholstered in rich leather sat in the center of the car. Each had its own table, adorned with a lamp and lace tablecloth, framed by heavy grey curtains that could be pulled to shutter the large windows. They were hung on rods capped with stylized condors, as if to remind the passengers just whose train they were riding on. The light reflected off polished fittings and decorations that made the car feel more like a rolling work of art than a mode of transportation. Booths had not been installed in the far edge of the car. Something close to a stable occupied that space instead. Sophie trotted over to this spot and lay down, evidently familiar with the space intended for her. Jedza settled into one of the booths, and Mikhail sat opposite her. The Basses didn't have time to situate themselves before the conductor, who had followed them into the car, addressed them. Madam, sir, I am told this is your first time riding with us, he said pleasantly. I trust you will find the accommodations of this locomotive sufficient. If you want for any food or drink, our staff will be more than happy to oblige. Please do not hesitate to mention any discomforts or desires. We at Condor Rails do our best to make every guest as comfortable as possible. We will begin our departure promptly. He doffed his cap again and left the car, sliding the door shut behind him. Wow. Better than baking under the hot sun, huh? Bernadette said, elbowing her father in the ribs. She ran and slid into one of the seats, stretching out her whole body. Oh, I could get used to this. Beats walking, that's for sure, she exclaimed. Jedza chortled. I'm sure Mikhail feels the same. It is not our usual way, but it will do. Divushka like Carrion likes to make sure everyone knows how moshny she is. Strong. Powerful, Jedza clarified, on seeing the looks of confusion on the Bass's faces. Who else is on this thing? Bernadette asked to no one in particular as she looked around. No one but the staff, Jedza replied. All to ourselves. It suddenly hit Bernadette. This was a private train. Custom built, too, by the look of things. Cornelius stumbled a bit when the train began moving. The opulence and thought of another good meal had distracted him long enough for the locomotive to start lurching forward as it picked up speed. He took a seat near Bernadette and continued taking in the view. How long did you say this would take? He asked. About a day or so, Mikhail replied, as he got up to inspect several expensive-looking bottles in a small bar that was next to Sophie's stable. He picked up one full of clear liquid and undid the cap, smelling the spirits within. He gave it a look of approval and picked up 3 small glasses. Cornelius held up 2 fingers. Mikhail caught on to what he meant and set one down. Bernadette quietly huffed in disappointment, but the soft cushions helped Cornelius ignore her pouting. For the first time in a long while, the lawman relaxed. Maybe the society wasn't all that bad. The trip was more than easy. Food was plentiful, as was drink, and the Condor Rail's attendants had even been able to provide Jedza with some interesting books and maps. A few of these made her way into her pack, but nobody said a word. Aside from meals, the group had been left mostly undisturbed. Another member of the staff came by to tend to their clothes. Cornelius and Bernadette tentatively but graciously accepted. Mikhail, sleeping off one too many drinks, didn't respond to the offer. The Bass's boots and dusters were whisked away to be cleaned and returned in a few hours, along with a light lunch. The train continued into the evening, the dark world speeding by outside. Cornelius allowed himself to fall asleep, rocked by the gentle shaking of wheels on rails. Bernadette was working through a plate of small sandwiches when the train pulled into a dilapidated station far west of Ridley, almost a day later to the minute. "Are we here?" Bernadette asked, pulling on her newly oiled boots. Jedza shook her head. "Niet. We must travel a ways more. Where we must go, the rails do not reach." She stood, umbrella in hand, and poked Mikhail to rouse him from his slumber. He yawned and began to instinctively prepare himself for travel again. His eyes began to linger on the Bass's coats and boots as he tiredly gathered his own belongings. "Are your jackets cleaner? And boots oiled?" he asked, giving a sidelong glance to the mostly empty bottle of spirits on his table. Jedza waggled her finger at Mikhail. "That is what you get for drinking too much. No oiled boots for you," she chided, before leading Sophie out of the railcar. Mikhail followed, and the pair started to loudly banter back and forth, in what Cornelius assumed was some sort of Russian. The Basses collected their things. Bernadette gave the interior of the train one last look before sighing heavily. Even though it had only been a day, she would miss riding in this lap of luxury. "Back to walking, I guess," Bernadette lamented. She picked up her small bundle of sandwiches, unwrapping another as she followed her father out of the train car. She stopped suddenly, and Bernadette collided into him. "Dad!" she exclaimed. A playful jab died in her throat when she gave a small squeak of excitement. Up ahead, floating above the empty contract town, was a dirigible. Maybe not, Cornelius said, taking in the craft's bulbous grey and gold balloon and ornate gondola. I guess it pays to have friends in high places. Jedza gave a dry laugh. Not always. Come. This will take us close to where we need to go. A few hours, maybe less. It will be up to the wind. She walked up to the dirigible's cabin crew, who looked suspiciously like mercenaries garbed in Condor Rail's grey. Dobry den. Ma'am, said one, a taller, clean-shaven man. He looked like he was about to say something to the other crewmen, but thought better of it. Without another word, he pulled open the stylized metal doors that led into the dirigible's passenger space. Welcome aboard. Jedza walked into the awaiting gondola with Sophie, which protested under the weight of her pack and the Auroch. Baz felt his stomach flip into his throat and instinctively reached out for one of the seats. Mikhail laughed as he brought up the rear. We aren't even off the ground yet, he said, patting the lawman on the shoulder. Not afraid of heights like your father, are you, Malishka? Jedza followed up, a playful lilt tinting her words. Bernadette shook her head. Not me, she said. Cornelius' jaw twitched. Just wait, Bee. This won't be anything like climbing back home. Bernadette's confidence quickly evaporated when the airship shuddered. With the sound of thrumming engines, the dirigible rose into the air. Cornelius swore under his breath as his stomach turned in attempted escape. Both he and Bernadette kept their eyes forward, until only passing clouds and tiny snowflakes offered any indication they were moving at all. Just as Jedza had said, the dirigible took only an hour to go further northwest, past Slate Ridge. To Cornelius it felt like an eternity. Every gust of wind that shook the gondola sent another wave of paralyzing dread through the lawman's body, squeezing his stomach, and making him feel as though his muscles would shatter his bones. Jedza's reassurances that the echoing groans of metal and the screaming winds outside the cabin were completely normal and nothing to worry about did little to help Cornelius' situation. That right there wasn't natural, he said to Mikhail when they landed. Just give me a horse next time. A few deep breaths and you will feel better, the Guardian said, steadying him while the lawman regained his footing. Cornelius looked around, fighting down a bit of nausea. Grey and craggy mountains towered around them, almost swallowing the entire horizon. To the south, there was little more than blasted tundra that gave way to tufts of brown grass. After disembarking, Jedza spoke to the crew. You will wait for us, please, she said. The two saluted, before closing up the gondola against the cold breeze. Cornelius looked at the dirigible with dread. If it were to leave, they'd be stranded. They will not depart until we return. This I promise, Jedza said, walking past her companions. Come, the way ahead is difficult, but we are close. Jedza and Mikhail seemed unbothered by the rocky terrain and thin air. Likewise, Sophie managed to climb the step-like protrusions of stone without any problem. The basses struggled at this elevation. When they finally reached a small plateau, Jedza stopped. They stood in front of an opening. It was tall and rectangular, with the appearance of an established, if abandoned, mine. Before anyone could enter, Jedza took a rod hung with lanterns from Sophie's pack. She placed her umbrella carefully alongside Sophie's boxes and bags. It is too dangerous to take you with us. You must wait for us, dear, she said to Sophie, laying her hand on the Auroch's head. The Auroch knelt, and Mikhail unhooked a large roll from her back. He laid it on the ground, and Sophie gingerly stepped on top. She settled down. Jedza gave her another pat and headed into the mine. What was that about? Bernadette asked. Mikhail shrugged. Sophie tends to roll around. Watch. Bernadette kept her eyes on Sophie as the four walked into the cave. Sure enough, once they'd gone far enough, the Auroch's bones clattered into a gentle, inanimate heap. Bernadette shuddered, and stuck close to her father as the cavernous entrance swallowed them all. The wooden braces that kept the mine shaft open were clearly old. The sound of wind cutting through the tunnel was unnerving, as was the creaking that came from the beams. "You sure this is safe?" Cornelius asked. He felt something tight close around his chest. He was a frontiersman, and not being able to see the open sky was uncomfortable. Jedza nodded. "Da. We are not the first ones to come this way. But part of the tunnel ahead has collapsed. We must move carefully there, one at a time." True to her word, the mine shaft seemed to get smaller and more claustrophobic as the group crept on. The braces had buckled in some places, and Cornelius saw the piles of rocks and boulders that had fallen from the ceiling. Jedza passed first, followed by Mikhail. Cornelius kept an eye on his daughter, and felt the cold spike of adrenaline when she suddenly recoiled. "What is it, Bee?" Cornelius whispered, moving quickly to her side. She pointed, embarrassed at the base of the rock pile. There was a skeleton, its lower half crushed by the stones. It appeared to be dressed in old mining gear, although time had reduced many of the clothes to tatters. Dried skin still clung to parts of the body, but the thing had started to gently spasm and move as though alive. "Do not worry," Jedza said calmly. "Once we move on, his bones will be quiet. I should have warned you." Bernadette was clearly shaken. "What happened?" she asked. Jedza shook her head. "An accident, I am told. He met his end regardless. Come, we must continue." Bernadette swallowed a lump in her throat and glanced back at the dead miner. The body kept reaching out, jaw moving wordlessly, until it was at the very edge of Jedza's light. Then it collapsed into a pile once more. It did not move again, but Bernadette still saw its emaciated face and bushy black beard in the darkness of the mine. The group picked their way through the tunnel for another few moments before it split in two. Before taking the rightmost path, Jedza stopped and tapped her staff on the ground. "This is a dangerous place." Her voice was calm, but the weight was evident. "I will warn you now. This is where lost things go to be forgotten. What is inside has been locked away for a reason. Do not touch anything. Do not go off on your own. Do not believe what your eyes tell you. If you feel you are losing yourself, focus on this." She lifted the staff hung with lanterns. "It is meant to keep the darkness away. Do you understand?" Everyone nodded. Jedza turned to Cornelius. "You are Krepki, salt of the earth, so I do not worry about you, but keep your little one close. That gun may come in handy, but only fire if I say. These walls could collapse, and even a mind as tough as yours can be fooled, da?" "Yes, I'll keep my eyes on those lanterns," Cornelius responded. "Wise," Jedza agreed. She tapped the end of the staff on the floor and began to set off down the dark path, greenish light doing its best to fight off the shadows, born deep inside the mountain. Tiny dust devils swirled across the ground in places, and streams of powdered stone fell in others, mimicking the sound of soft footsteps. Sometimes the shadows cast by lantern light looked human. Cornelius had to stop himself from flinching and turning when they beckoned and flitted across the edges of his vision. He felt like he was being watched, but no gleaming eyes emerged from the dark. Mikhail kept a firm gaze on Jedza's lanterns, but he seemed to react as Cornelius did. Little movements triggered the swordsman's instincts, only to reveal there was never anything there. The echoes in the distance were worse. Every footstep sent out noise, which came back distorted and unsettling. They slid through the air and changed into other things entirely. Familiar voices and false whispers wrapped around everyone. "What?" Bernadette called out. She stopped walking, but Cornelius pulled her forward. "It's not real, Bee," he said, voice almost breaking. "None of this is." "Your father is right, Milishka," Jedza said sadly. "This is a place of cursed things. You must be strong." "No hexes," Mikhail said to himself, as though the words could strengthen his resolve. Though it seemed like hours, the group had only been walking the winding paths for a fragment of that time. Shapes began to break out of the dark. A horde of objects and strange items lay scattered, as though thrown and torn apart in a frantic search. Other piles remained clustered in corners or near pillars that supported the high cavern ceilings. A large dusty mirror rested against one column. Bottles and broken glass twinkled under Jedza's light. Pendants hung from blades like jeweled spider webs, though there were just as many mundane bits of metal, cloth, and bone strewn throughout. Carved columns supported the enormous weight of the mountain above. Strange taxidermy glared out of the gloom. The walls glowed iridescent in spots and absorbed light elsewhere. Thick dust covered the floor, but a central trail had been swept clear. Jedza stopped for a moment, bending to look at the ground before continuing, muttering to herself. The group pressed on. Mikhail navigated his way through the horde of strange items and trinkets. As Jedza passed, the bones of a human arm began to slowly rattle. It came crawling towards Jedza, as though it still had a bit of its previous owner's fiery temperament. She sidestepped the appendage and looked to Mikhail. "Do you think she would want if we took it back to her?" Mikhail chuckled. "I think she prefers her new one. A bottle of whiskey would do better." He used the end of his sword to move the arm out of the way, and held up his hand to stop the basses from advancing further. Jedza shrugged off her pack. She reached into one of its side pockets and carefully removed a length of thread. It was difficult to see, even with the light. The edges were both colorless and wondrous, like the night sky reflected in a prismatic pool of water. For a moment, the thread captured everyone's attention. It was simple, but more powerful a thing than most of them had ever seen. A crumpled humanoid form lay barely illuminated, surrounded by more trinkets and antiquities. It was difficult to see. The flesh was sickly pale. The thing was emaciated. One eye reflected almost green. "Who will have the honor?" Jedza asked, holding up the thread. No one moved. "I have all the time in the world," Jedza continued. "You all do not. Come." More silence. Then Bernadette stepped forward. "I'll do it." "Bee, don't," Cornelius whispered as loudly as he could. "Dad, I can do this," Bernadette said casually. She squared her shoulders and looked at Jedza. "What do I do?" Jedza handed her the length of thread. Now it seemed almost clear, like gossamer. When Bernadette took it, her eyes widened in surprise at how heavy the thread was. "What is this thing?" she asked. "You will place this across its back. The thread will do the rest. If it does not, that is when your father should have his gun ready." "Be careful, Bee," Bass cautioned. He unslung his shotgun and pointed it directly at the dead husk. Bernadette walked up to the corpse and carefully draped the thread over it before walking back. "See, Dad? No problem." "You did well." Jedza patted Bernadette on the hand before approaching the creature. She nudged the body with her foot a few times, stepped back and waited. It took some time, but the thing eventually stirred. Its desiccated muscles twitched violently. Shivers and minor spasms helped shake dust and dirt from the skin. Beneath, the thing's blackened veins slowly turned the lightest shade of green. A pale light gradually filled the soul stones inside each eye socket, as though the magic seeping into the creature's body was struggling to evict the presence of death. As the veins inside its bulging neck began to recede, the creature lifted its head. The right side of its face appeared crushed, and one of its deer-like antlers was shattered. It seemed to peer about for a moment in a daze, before starting to thrash wildly, trying to pull itself up from the floor to stand. The thread somehow, thankfully, held it in place. A terrible scream erupted from its dried and ruined throat. One clawed hand kept grasping and covering its broken face, while the other, trapped beneath the body, struggled in vain to break free and release itself. Its back legs worked weakly. The thread made any sort of retreat impossible, but the creature still breathed heavily from exertion and blind panic, attempting to pull itself to safety. Jedza spoke in a clear voice, ignoring the frenzied attempts at panic violence. "I am glad you are with us again. Be calm. I am not one of their servants. I only have questions." Its saltstone eyes, cat-like in the dark, were now fully illuminated and focused on Jedza. The thing's mouth stretched open, still snarling. The long tongue tasted the air, flicking between narrow fangs. A vicious claw swiped ineffectively at the air, but left a deep gouge in the stone where the creature was sprawled. It strained. The thread cut into its sickly flesh. Jedza stepped forward and raised a hand. "We are no threat," she said evenly. "Calm yourself. You are returned to this world, for the moment." Sharp claws continued to open and close as its memory slowly unclouded. The creature turned as much as it was able, exhaling before taking a rattling breath, coughing and clearing its throat as if it had not spoken in some time. Eventually, two very different feminine voices managed to form words, although they were high-pitched, stressed the wrong syllables, and drew out words oddly. "You are not our little bird, the one we want to tear apart for what she has done. No, this one is a curiosity, yes. Such power, so much life to share, and yet so little. Knows much but wants not. What is it that she seeks?" "Knowledge of the machine, and a question from another," Jedza replied. The thing's face split into a lopsided grin, as though it held all the cards, despite being weighed down by the thread. "We will tell her of the machine first, yes, if she offers something of equal value in return." Jedza shifted. "What is your price?" "We sent something from the 13 within her bag. The curiosity knows what it is. She does. We would take it." Jedza reached down into her bag. The creature retreated back into itself as it waited. Behind her the others watched, each clenching their own weapons, but with no desire to get closer to the awakened dead. "What is that thing?" Cornelius asked, ignoring his own desire to run. "I do not know its past, but Jedza has called it a herald of that which has no name," Mikhail replied softly. "Everything has a name. If it ever had a name, it was lost to history before us, a time before even Jedza." "That's helpful," Bernadette said quietly. Despite a brave face, she shook with adrenaline and fear. Though the room's tricks had quieted, the herald was just as disturbing. The younger Bass watched as Jedza produced a lens of shining crystal from her bag and placed it in front of the herald. The creature mumbled to itself, claws flexing, before it grinned. "We find this exchange acceptable." The thing's voices reverberated throughout the room, both impossibly loud and quiet at the same time. "What does the curiosity wish to know?" "We have found the first piece. Where do we find the others?" The herald did not take its eyes off Jedza as it spoke. "The first is where still waters died and the crown was set in black. The second is covered in dust where nothing good grows. The third twists and turns above the world, but invisible to the living eye. The fourth rests where it all began, and where it will all begin again. And the fifth, it said, voices filling with glee, is with us. I see, Jedza said coolly. Does the curiosity wish to make another bargain? For the question and for our piece of the machine, the herald hissed, tongue flicking across its broken teeth. It mockingly beckoned her with a claw. She must tell us what she wishes to know. Jedza walked forward with a painful slowness. Mikhail moved forward half a step, its heavy blade at the ready. Cornelius brought up his shotgun, trained on the herald. The Basses and Mikhail waited as Jedza spoke her question to the herald, too quiet for any other to hear. The thing's eyes twinkled, and it bobbed its head eagerly. Yes, we can tell her the answer to that. But a question from another lets us choose our own price, it does. And what is that? Jedza asked bluntly. This thread, this weight across us. Give wonderful secrets in return, yes. A secret that curiosity badly wants. Jedza shook her head, earrings clinking on the sides of her skull. Yet, it is not a gift or bauble. It is a burden, and one that cannot be borne for long. The herald grinned. Then we will ask for the one that touched the thread, the one that is part of this bargain as well. It pointed at Bernadette. Immediately Cornelius raised his shotgun, cocking it and stepping towards Jedza and the herald. He glared at Mikhail, suddenly doubting the alliances they'd made. The old guardian brought his sword around and kept his eyes trained on Cornelius, but watched Jedza. The lawman had no doubt he would attack if that undead woman asked him to, but Mikhail couldn't withstand a few loads of buckshot. From behind him, he heard Bernadette's knife slide from its sheath. This ain't your fight, B, Cornelius called back. Go on and get back to the front of the cave. We're done here. Mikhail took a fighting stance. Careful now. That's Voikosia, Sheriff, Jedza snapped. Mikhail Prakratieto. She kept her veiled gaze trained on the herald. The protector slowly lowered his sword. Cornelius did not lower his shotgun. The herald was still grinning sickly, his jaw dangling from a length of cracked bone and dried skin. Jedza allowed the tension in the air to diffuse slightly. She shook her head again. Yet, the girl is not part of this. Whatever price you name, I will be the one to pay it. No one else. Something flashed in one of the herald's broken eyes. If this is what the curiosity truly wishes, we will trade. But she cannot decline our next offer, or she leaves here without the answer she seeks, and without the piece of the machine she wants. Jedza waited. Da. I accept. The herald took sadistic pleasure in its final offer. The thing she treasures most, the thing that is heaviest for her to carry. If she does, we will tell her these things and more. She made no motion toward her bag. Instead, Jedza cautiously moved her veil aside and fumbled with something, before pulling a tiny chain over her head. At the end were 2 rings, one in simple gold, heavily battered and tarnished, and one edged in blue stones. Both shone very dimly in the light, but the herald wheezed in pleasure. Jedza slipped the ring inlaid with blue stones from the chain and laid it delicately in front of the herald. No, no, little one, both. They are heaviest for her together. The herald's claw shook as it pointed to the gold ring still on the necklace. For the first time since he had served her, Mikhail saw Jedza stiffen. She stayed still for a very long while. One hand moved at her side, back and forth. There was only silence and stillness in the cavern. Finally, after what seemed like a lifetime, Jedza made her choice. "Niet, Jedza," Mikhail said, shocked. She held a hand out behind her, and Mikhail fell silent. Jedza hesitated one last time, before reverently placing the chain and gold band into a small pile. "There. It is yours. She has given us the most valuable thing she has. So old. Worth more than everything she has ever held. We give her our piece of the great machine, and answer her question for another, and offer a secret of our own." The corpse made a gesture with one claw. In the darkness far beyond, there was a sound, a clattering and clinking, like falling coins in sand. A small thing rolled into the light of Jedza's lanterns. It was an orb, lined with small glyphs. The sphere itself was made of a strange dark material, and bands of lighter metal wrapped around it in seemingly random patterns. "Now we will answer the curiosity's question for another. Telling the fate of one has become impossible for all but two. But our mistress sees outside their false truth. All loving mothers return to their babes, but not with the skin in which they bore their children. A choice will be made, hers and hers alone, that we cannot see." The words echoed inside Jedza's skull. The others heard nothing but discordant murmurs. The herald's jaw danced as it licked its lips. "We must make our exchange equal. We must. The herald beckoned as best it could with a sharp nail. "We know something she has wanted for a very long time." Jedza hesitated again, but slowly leaned forward. Before Mikhail even readied his blade, the thing simply touched the tip of its clawed finger to Jedza's forehead. The creature broke out into another dark grin as its secret flooded into her mind. "Does she understand? Or shall we explain again?" Jedza's finger bones clicked against the sphere when she picked it up from the floor. Without another word, she nestled the orb underneath her shawls, retrieved her pack, and walked away. The herald did not stop grinning until Jedza had gone a dozen paces, and then let out a strained gurgle before collapsing, once again nothing more than an empty corpse. Mikhail kept a respectful distance. There would be time to discuss what had happened later. "Do we need to get the thread?" Bernadette asked, shoulders squared back, but her voice shaking. "Niet. It is done." Jedza watched the thread begin to dissolve until it was nothing. "We have spent too much time here. Let us leave this place." The whispers and dust had gone silent. In their place, the room's treasures seemed to peek from their covers of darkness. Cornelius looked at his daughter and pulled her into a quick embrace. "We're okay, Bee," her father said. "Let's get out of here." The Basses followed Jedza's lanterns bobbing ahead. The distance between them had thrown the cavern into an unsteady gloom. Suddenly the clang of metal echoed throughout the chamber, sending a shock of icy adrenaline through the lawman's body. He instinctively brought up his shotgun, trying to locate the source of the sound, before seeing Bernadette almost disappear in front of him. She had stumbled, barely catching herself on an old mirror. More trinkets clattered and chimed in the dark. Bernadette stood up almost immediately, a flush of unease and embarrassment creeping across her face. "Malishka!" Jedza called angrily from ahead, staff rapping on the stone floor. "What did I say? Do not touch anything." Cornelius helped steady his daughter, ignoring Jedza's scolding and the dying echoes of the chamber's disturbed treasures. "You okay?" "Yeah," Bernadette snapped, pulling away from him. She immediately dropped her head. "Sorry." "It's all right, Bee," Cornelius said. "Just keep your eyes up. If you trip again, I'll tell Rykard." Bernadette rolled her eyes, quickly leaving her embarrassment behind. I'd rather you just left me here. Cornelius followed his daughter around the chamber's twisting pathways. Jedza's lamps eventually cast one final glow on the walls before the relics of ages past were once again swallowed by darkness. Nobody noticed the distorted form that rippled within the glass of the mirror Bernadette had caught herself on. None were there to notice the 2 long fingers tracing the edges of the handprint left in the dust, or the hint of a too wide smile. If any living thing had been present, they might have noticed a tiny crack start to work its way across the mirror. No one spoke for the remainder of the journey back. Jedza passed by the skeleton too quickly for it to muster anything more than a few twitching finger bones. Once the greying sky was visible, everyone visibly relaxed. The basses remained close to the pathway, while Jedza and Mikhail moved to fetch the aurochs pile that they had left behind. On Jedza's approach, Sophie's bones began to stand up again. In a few moments the auroch was happily trotting over to Jedza as though no time had passed. The old woman just stared at Sophie for a long while, tracing the lines of her bleached skull and dark horns with her gloved hands. She motioned wordlessly to Mikhail. When she did, the pair started back down the trail. The basses were close behind. It took some time for the mountain winds to blow away the memories that had been dredged up in that foreboding place. Once the dirigible came back into view, Cornelius let the last of the tension out of his shoulders. They would at least be able to get home. Mikhail helped Jedza down a crumbling shelf of stones. The old woman adjusted her hood and glasses before approaching the basses, holding out the sphere. Bring this to that stuffy old manor, and give Gretchen my best. Not everyone can age gracefully. She was looking dreadful last time we spoke. Cornelius carefully took the sphere. It wasn't cold, but something about the thing made him uneasy. The runes on its edges almost seemed to speak to him. The words didn't make any sense in his mind, but they were close to having some meaning. Do not touch it for long, Jedza said. She held up a plain burlap sack, pulled from her own expansive collection. Cornelius dropped the orb into the bag and tied it shut. She continued, Give her this as well. Jedza had a long quill pen and a tiny jar of ink in one hand. She gestured at Mikhail, and the bodyguard knelt on one knee. Using his broad back, Jedza scribbled something on the paper, folded it, and gave it to the sheriff. There was another moment of extended silence, as though the awkwardness of the first meeting had returned for this goodbye. I did not realize that more would be needed to have all of our goals accomplished, Jedza said guardedly. You are good people. I am sorry for involving you so deeply, little one. Well, I'm sorry you had to give up your rings, Bernadette replied uncomfortably. Must have been pretty valuable for that thing to pick them over me. Jedza tilted her head in what she hoped resembled something of a kind gesture. All things come and go. No matter. A life is something different. I would not willingly cut one like yours short. Cornelius looked at Mikhail and tensely offered a hand. We protect our own, he said. The swordsman returned the handshake. Da, that we do. I wish you both safe travels. Wait, aren't you coming back with us? Bernadette asked. It's a long way back to, well, wherever you come from, I'd think. Ah, Malishka, as long as Mikhail and I are together, we are home. Besides, there are other places we must go. Perhaps we will meet again if I choose to travel to your Badlands someday. I would like that. Cornelius tipped his hat. We'd be glad to have you. I suppose we'll be off then. Come on, Bee. Let's get on that thing before it leaves. The discomfort in Cornelius' voice was evident, but a few terrible minutes in the air was better than weeks of traveling underprepared in the northern wilderness. Jedza watched the basses head back to the dirigible. Bernadette turned back to wave before they boarded. Once it drifted out of sight, Jedza began to walk in the opposite direction. "Come, we have a long way yet to go," she said. Mikhail eyed Jedza as she walked with Sophie. He started with a lighter question. "You said Gretchen was a dangerous woman. Is giving her that thing a good idea?" He braced himself for a sharp retort, but it never came. The old woman was more contemplative than usual, hand feeling for the tiny weight around her neck that would never be replaced. "Gretchen will get her toy. We will pay our debt. My debt. And father and daughter will be none the wiser. Let them have their wild frontier for a little longer. The world will still be here long after all of them have gone, in some form or another." "And you, Harold?" Mikhail ventured. "What did it offer you?" Beneath her veil, if Jedza still had lips, she would have smiled. Cornelius Bass's spurs clinked on the marble floors of the Explorers Society manor. He had walked the halls before, but informally. This would be his first official meeting with the heads of the society. He had tried to clean himself up as best as possible before arriving, but he still felt underdressed. The steward he was following didn't seem to mind. "Sheriff Cornelius Bass," a very fat man greeted right as the steward opened his door. He held 2 glasses of something alcoholic, based on the number of bottles stacked neatly in the little bar. He waddled over and handed one to Cornelius, who accepted with forced politeness. Wasn't there anyone else but Ludwig he could talk to? "To congratulate you on your successful acquisition and return to the, Ludwig stumbled off. The lawman had downed his drink in one go, and now held the glass casually in one hand. Well, and your safe return to the Explorers Society as a full member," Ludwig concluded. He raised his own glass and sipped delicately. "Now I assume you've brought something for us." Bass reached into a satchel and pulled out the orb and bit of paper. Ludwig squeaked in excitement and scuttled back behind his desk to place the relic on a small stand. He smoothly opened the note and read it before smiling up at the sheriff. Well done indeed. Tremendous work. Now, I know your employment lies with the guild, but we've pulled some strings and gotten approval from the Governor General himself to have you assist us in some delicate matters, if you are interested. The rewards of society work can be quite lucrative," Ludwig continued. He slid a society's signet ring across the table, atop a small stack of important-looking papers. Bass saw a few words that made his heart skip a beat. He put his glass down on the desk and stood at the back of one of the plush chairs in the office. "What's the job?" the sheriff finally asked. Ludwig sat back in his chair with a self-satisfied smile.
That's it for another episode of the Breachside Broadcast. Join us next time for more Tales of Malifaux.